The Damned, Là-bas by J.K. Huysmans? Huysman? Huysmans?
Cecilia?
Huysman. I don't really know how to pronounce these things. I'm not French, thank God. I'm kidding. Put your baguettes down. Put the baguettes down! But anyway, I've just finished reading this book recently and it was one of the best reads that I had all of last year. And so today I'm just going to talk about my thoughts about this book, and I'm going to include some minor spoilers but with two caveats. The first one being, when it comes to a book like this, there's not really that much you can spoil, which will become clearer as the video progresses. And the second point is that minor things that I do spoil, they're not gonna really affect your enjoyment of the book very much at all. So with that in mind, if you are one of the 6 people who have read this book, I'm really interested to hear your opinions about it. If you think I'm really stupid, explain to me why. I want to hear about it. Tell me your thoughts about this wonderful, wonderful book. Down there. Hey, not down there. In the comments. Oh my God. So listen, this is one of those books where the main point of it, the main action of what's going on, it doesn't really have much to do with things happening so much, right? But in this particular case, it's so much more about the discussions, the conversations that happen, which are so interesting, so thoughtful, and they're so gripping that they were the main reason why I kept reading this book. And the book starts off with exactly such a conversation, and in that way it reminds me a little bit of how Victor Hugo began Les Miserables. He says something like, and now to relate something which has little to do with the events of which we're about to relate, blah 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 blah. And so he sets the tone of his book as one of digression, one of tangents, you know, and the whole book, the 1,300 pages is largely tangents and essays and ideas that he has that are interesting. And so this sets the tone of that book as one of sightseeing, the alleyways of life. Now this isn't that, but it's very similar. So in The Damned, the discussions that go on, they're a lot more focused around a couple of central themes. It's not exactly like Les Mis, which is sprawling everywhere on a million different facets of human life. The Damned is much more constrained to a couple of simple themes, mostly Satanism, morality, aesthetic, faith, at times religion, at times love, at times money and society. A variety of different things, but they all sort of revolve around the same basic notion, and that they all reflect and inform off of one another. It makes for a really interesting reading experience. So, what is the actual content of this book? If you read the introduction, which you never do if you want to have a good time, the introduction mentions a little bit about the binary nature of the book, that there's 2 main themes. One being the crimes of Gilles de Rais, a historical figure, and the other being the courtship with Madame Chanteloup. If I don't pronounce these names correctly, I'm not French, so you'll sue me. But although the introduction mentions these 2 binary aspects, to me there's the third part, which sort of ties everything together and elevates it all, and that is the conversations, the discussions that happen. And this binary view, I think it's a huge oversimplification, and of course, I'm sure whoever wrote the introduction, Mr. Terry Hale, agrees with that as well, because to me, how it felt as I was reading this is that the 2 halves of these 2 binary halves, they overlap and they intermingle with one another, and it really felt like the waves of 2 different oceans crossing one another, and each of them giving something to the other that makes it interesting and that evolves it and changes it. Even when I had very little idea of what they were talking about, or even little interest in the topic itself, the way that Huysmans writes is so satisfying, and it's so analytically clear when you read it, that even if you care nothing for the topic, you enjoy reading it because it's interesting. As I was making some notes, it really struck me that this is what people listen to podcasts for, because I assume that the conversations that they have are very interesting. And to me, this is like a really great podcast. And I'll talk a lot about this more, but these people are all having different conversations, or rather the same conversation, but with many different points of view and perspectives that make it so interesting and rewarding to listen in on. They be a fly on the wall in these people's lives. And if you enjoy it all, philosophy, analysis, contemplation, I think you'll love listening to any of these conversations or reading them. So when you read this book and you read the dialogues and you read the internal monologues even, you feel like you're not hearing the the thoughts of a writer who's putting his thoughts on the page. What you really get a feeling of is you get a sense that you're witnessing the whole life of a character who's speaking, because every opinion that they give, that they voice, it sounds not like an opinion that the writers contrived, but it really sounds like a consequence of everything that they've lived through in the full development of their lives from beginning to end. Whatever they've lived through, whatever positions in society that they're in, whatever their vocation is, whatever their passions are, all of this informs their opinion, and it comes through in what they say. And it's so wonderful to read, and it's so refreshing when you read a book and you see so many characters who have their own thoughts, who reflect on their own lives, and they don't just serve as ingredients to a plot. They're really their own people. They have their own lives, and you just get to witness them, and it's not just something that the authors contrived. That's one of these wonderful aspects of this book that's really 10 out of 10 for me. And as a prime example of exactly what I'm talking about, in the very first chapter, in the very first page, the main character, Dutal, and his best friend, Dehermi, they're having a very engaging conversation regarding the literary merit of two different schools of literature. On the one hand, naturalism, and on the other hand, materialism. And when I was glancing back at the first chapter before making this video, it reminded me right away of the length and the distance which Huysmans has gone in his own mind in developing his own opinions and thought about them on either side, to be able to write such developed characters who say things about the topic in a very honest and unfiltered way. And when you hear them, you truly do feel like you're hearing the opinions of someone who's lived a life and had thoughts and experiences which have developed their beliefs. So everything in this book follows Dutal. We're never really away from him, and that lends a whole cozy fireside charm to the story, which is really an interesting contrast. You have this cozy fireside image of you're sitting with Dutal in his little flat with his kitten and his thoughts, whereas on the other hand, the content matter of the book is often so disturbing, so graphical, evil, pessimistic, and at times definitely very hellish and fiery elements to the story. So you have these sort of two metaphorical flames going on here. Of course, there's never really any like flame of the sort mentioned, but it's something you think up of on your own as you're reading it. And there's these two lovely contrasts between Dutal's coziness and the actual flaming fiery worlds of hell that he's trying to wade his way into in order to write his book. And hand in hand with the conversations that he has with other characters, that other characters have with others in his presence, is also the conversations that Dutal has in his own mind. The way he thinks, it's just, to me, it was a very interesting and well-written way of a character's internal monologue. And the first example of this appears again in chapter 1. So in chapter 1, Dutal gives us a 2.5 page, maybe 3-page description of a portrait of Christ that he saw while he was visiting in Germany some weeks ago before the story began, or maybe a year ago, I don't exactly remember. Now, I don't know about you, but I love it when writers describe paintings in their writing. Now, the reason why is you look up the painting, right? You look up the painting and you look at it for yourself for a little bit, and then you read what the writer has written. And then as you read this, you look at the elements in the painting and you try to match it up, and you listen to their interpretation, and then it helps you interpret something else for yourself. And it's like all of a sudden, in this new artwork that you found, it's like you have a new friend for life, you know? It's this painting, it's a whole story, a whole host of meanings that you find in it, that you've now received after having read what this author's written. And not only that, but on the other hand, you can also appreciate the thoughtfulness of the author who's done this thinking, this reflecting, this interpreting of the art, and graced you with it in this other work of art. So at the end of this video, I'm actually going to put up a photo of the painting as well as captions from the book, and I'll do a narration over the top of it so you can see for yourself what I'm talking about. And one whole half of the novel, although if you summed it up, it will probably only be about 30 to 40 pages, consists in Dutal writing his book, okay? And this book within a book was actually one of my favorite parts of this novel. Because he's writing something that reads much like a documentary about this child murderer from the 15th century. And it had some of the most disturbing and shocking descriptions of crimes that I've ever read in any literature, where Dutal, in order to put himself into the mind of Gilles de Rais, the infamous killer, and in order to write of his life more clearly, he has to really go into clear detail in his own imagination about the child murders that took place. And this was one of the most gripping parts of any book I read all year, maybe even the year before. it just had me on the edge of my seat. I couldn't believe what I was reading. And so that brings us to another aspect of the book that is just part of the wonderful structure of it all. So as Dotal wishes to know more about the world he's thinking about inwardly, in order to make his fantasies about Rai's crimes and his life in the satanic world clearer and more detailed for the book he's writing, he's kind of pulled out more and more into the real world, out of his imagination, not only by the desire to write better, but by his imaginations captured by a certain woman who starts sending him mysterious letters, very, very seductive, mysterious letters, where he goes to visit his friend, De Hermes, and his friend of his friend, Car, I'm just gonna call him Car because I don't really know how to pronounce French things, but Car and Car's wife. And so he gets closer and closer to living out this world of evil that he's henceforth only imagined, because as he goes out he finds connections to people who are linked with Satanism and the Black Mass and all these evil things. And now the thing about Dotal, right? Now I've been talking a lot about his imagination, and what you have to understand about this book is Dotal he's a 40-year-old man and of some experience, right? His imagination, it's not fairy tales and unicorns, but rather it's a brutal and realistic imagination. In fact, in this regard, I think there's a bit of a parallel between him and the criminal he's writing about, Gilles de Rais, because Gilles is cited as boasting of having gone further in the human experience than any man has ever gone before or ever will. And to me, Dotal similarly has this mindset, but only inwardly, where he seems to have no limits in what he's going to imagine. He has no fear of plumbing the deepest depths of human evil. Now you could argue that some of what he writes about in his book is taken from the evidence that came out at Rai's trial in 1440, but there's definitely, I think, a lot of it also comes from his own imagination. On top of that, I think there might also be some parallels between Rai's ending that is written about by Dotal in his book, as well as Dotal's own ending in the book, in the external frame story of what's going on here. As I said, this is one of the books that I enjoyed the most last year. I enjoyed it about as much as my second favorite. I don't really know which one's the most favorite, but that is Childhood, Boyhood, Youth by Tolstoy. I really, really love this book as well. I definitely recommend it. It's absolutely had me binging it pretty much. Tolstoy is just such an incredible writer, but as much as I'd like to talk about him, I'm gonna stick to Huysmans. So the reason why I like both these books is it's not so much about the things happening that's the main bit, although there's quite a bit happening in both of them. It's more so about the description of those things, being drawn into them, seeing them from the clear and well-written perspective of a character who's insightful and thoughtful and understands things. And even feelings aren't necessarily so important. That's not what is drawing me in the most. What maybe is drawing me in the most is the conversations that are going on here. But there is a little bit of that, because there's this love side plot that happens in the story, and that drew me in with some curiosity, because I really wanted something nice and interesting to happen to Dotal, because he's such an insular, almost lonely old man. He'd be completely lonely if he didn't have his art. So living as he does, you know, happiness to him, it seems like such a distant, foreign notion, very irrelevant even. And that kind of brings me to what I think is one of the main questions of this novel, which is, how does one find meaning in life other than in artistic pursuit? Faith, perhaps? And then the next question is, well, what do you put your faith in? In Satan, in Jesus, in something else? We get to witness a Black Mass taking place, and it's a complete desecration of Jesus. The reason why is because the Satanists believe that he's betrayed humanity by not appearing to save them. The Black Mass is striking, yes, but to me it's nothing like the description of the crimes that took place 500 years ago in the world of the novel. The child murders done by Gilles de Rais. Maybe this is just because we're forced to see the victims ourselves and imagine them ourselves through Dotal's writing, the book within the book. So there's definitely some shock value there, I won't lie. But to me, I think it's a very good type of shock value. Of course, there were definitely some parts which, if you asked me about now, I wouldn't really be able to explain it to you, either because I wasn't paying enough attention or I was only half interested. Like, for example, there was this one aspect that there were these two priests. There was like a good priest and an evil priest who were kind of having this like telepathic, magical battle to the death between one another. And maybe when I was reading those sections, I just hadn't slept enough and couldn't pay attention. But, you know, there was some minor aspect I skipped over. But, you know, what kept me going in this one was as I keep saying, just the wonderful dialectical discussions that go on pretty much every single page, every single chapter. Now, there are a lot of layers to this book, and so I think that that means that anyone who reads it is going to find something different that they find interesting. And that's just one of the great parts about books like this, is there is so much there. It's a very short book. It's only 250 pages, but it's really densely packed, I think. This was recommended to me by the manager at the bookstore that I tend to go to. We were talking about different classics that we like, and she suggested this one to me, and I'm really glad I picked it up. And one thing that features a bit in these layers, one thing that I picked up on, is that there's something about confronting and escaping nihilism in this book. So as I mentioned, it's a little bit about how does one find meaning in life. And so in the end of the very first chapter, Dotal reflects a little bit about finding the purpose to life. And he says to himself, how nice is it just to stay home and live in your mind, and to just examine history, examine the mind and soul of one of the evilest men, and there's an artistic process that captures you and that enraptures you, that colors your life and gives you meaning. And in some ways, the fact that his thoughts are so expansive about it and detailed as we read about them, it makes you think, well, if this guy just stayed at home all day, every day, he'd still have a very interesting inner life, much more interesting than most people. Because as I was reading, I thought, this is just so satisfying to read. Everything is so well explored, let's put it that way. But aside from that, Dotal is really kind of faced with either a meaningless existence or this kind of self-consuming process of art, which it'll keep you occupied long enough while you're doing it, so that you hope you might never finish and you'll always have something to do. And if you finish it, you risk being left with nothing, because how often is it going to happen that you're going to be completely consumed by the creation of a particular piece of art? You have to keep finding these things. And especially in Dotal's solitary old age, he frequently mentions how he has really no real libido anymore. He doesn't really have any real joy in society, either in literary society or really in his friends. But all he has is a cat at home and his thoughts to entertain him. And while this poignancy isn't really heavily underlined in the book, I think it's definitely there. It's kind of in between the lines, and this just adds such a interesting and rich flourish of something almost like tragedy to the whole ordeal. And yet it's not tragedy, because it's his life and it's interesting, and I had so much fun reading it. But at the same time, there is some little aspect of tragedy to it. And you can ask yourself about it. What is the point to any of this? What is the point to any of it? And maybe you find an answer. But whether the answer is disappointing or not, that's something for you to think about. And there's so much to think about with this book. So that's why I say this was a really 5-star book, to be honest with you. What I wanted to do real quickly for you is just to read out this portrait for you. It is a 3-page description, but I'm going to put the photo up and I'm going to narrate it in my best narrative voice for you, just so you can see maybe what I'm talking about. He shuddered in his armchair and closed his eyes as if in pain. He could revisualize the picture there before him with extraordinary lucidity. And here, in his study, he mentally repeated the gasp of admiration which had escaped him as he had entered the little room in the Castle Museum as the Christ rose before him, impressive, on a cross, the trunk crudely transversed by an untrimmed branch, by way of arms, which bent like a bow under the weight of the body. As taut as a spring, it was as if this merciful branch was ready to propel the suffering flesh, transfixed to the world by the great nails which pierced the feet far away from this cruel, sinful planet. Dislocated, almost ripped from their sockets, the arms of the Christ seemed bound their entire length in bulging cords of muscles. The tortured tendons of the armpits looked ready to snap, the hands wide open, brandishing fingers contorted in a confused gesture of benediction and reproach. The trembling pectorals greasy with sweat, the ribcage standing out of the torso like a row of staves, the flesh swollen and bruised, speckled with flea bites, pockmarked by the pinpricks left in the skin by the scourges. Purulence was setting in. The seeping wound in the side dripped thickly, inundating the thigh with blood that was like congealed blackberry juice. A milky pus tinged with a pinkish hue, similar to those grey Moselle wines, oozed down the chest and over the abdomen with its rumpled loincloth. The knees had been forced together, twisting the shins outwards over the feet which, stapled one on top of the other, had begun to putrefy and turn green beneath the seeping blood. These congealing, sponge-form feet were terrible to behold. The flesh swelled over the head of the nail, while the toes, furiously clenched with their blue hood-like horns, contradicted the imploring gesture of the hands, turning benediction into a curse as they frantically clawed at the ochre-colored earth, as ferruginous as the purple soil of Thuringia.
Above this erupting cadaver rose the head, tumultuous and huge. Encircled by a ragged crown of thorns, it hung down lifeless, one lackluster eye half open in which a shudder of terror and sorrow could be detected. The face was furrowed, the brow craggy, the cheeks blanched, the features crushed and defeated, weeping, while the sagging mouth, with its lower jaw racked by titanic contractions, laughed atrociously. The torture had been unendurable, an agony which had forced the joking executioners to take to their heels. Now, against the dark sky, the color of night, the cross seemed to descend until it barely hovered above the ground, while two figures, one on each side, kept watch over the Christ. One was the Virgin, wearing a blood-red hood cascading in tight waves over a blue robe with long pleats in it. Her face was rigid and pale, swollen with tears like that of someone digging their nails deep into the palms of their hands. The other was St. John, some species of vagabond, a sunburnt Swabian priest, very tall, his beard crimped into little corkscrews, dressed in a garment that looked like it had been cut out of bark. Over this he wore a scarlet tunic with a mantle of yellow chamois, puckered at the sleeves to reveal a lining of feverish green like unripened lemons. Exhausted from weeping, but possessed of more endurance than Mary, who though broken and spent was still standing, he joined his hands and swept forward towards the corpse which he contemplated with filmy red eyes, and he sobbed and choked silently in his mute outrage. How far removed one is when confronted by this bloody and tear-stained Calvary from those debonair Golgothas adopted by the Church ever since the Renaissance. This lockjawed Christ is no Christ of the rich, no Galilean Adonis, no dandified picture of health, no handsome youth with curly brown tresses, divided beard, and insipid equine features such as the faithful have worshipped for the last 4 centuries. This is the Christ of St. Justin, St. Basil, St. Cyril, Tertullian, the Christ of the early Christian Church, the common Christ, made ugly by the assumption of the whole burden of our sins and clothed from humility in the most abject manner. This is the Christ of the poor, the Christ who is one and the same with the most wretched of those he has come to save, the beggars and outcasts, all those whose indigence and helplessness redeem mankind's cowardice, but it is also the most human of Christs, frail of flesh, abandoned by the Father until every torture has been exhausted, the Christ, like all those who are in agony, with no recourse except to his mother who, though heeding of his childish cries, is powerless to help. In his infinite humility, he had agreed to suffer the passion to the utmost extent of the human capacity to bear pain, and in obedience to an order beyond our comprehension, he had cast off divinity at the time of the scourging and the blows and the insults spat in his face, from these wanton preliminaries right through to the unspeakable torment of an endless agony. Nor did he spare himself so that the fall might be more complete during this lingering death, a death such as a thief or a dog might suffer. So vile and base was it, even the final ignominies of pestilence and putrefaction. Never, neither before nor since, had such a subject been broached from a naturalist perspective. Never before had a painter depicted the divine charnel house so thoroughly, or dipped his brush so brutally in running sores and bleeding sockets. It was extreme and it was horrifying. Grunewald was the most uncompromising of realists, but to regard this redeemer of the Doss House, this god of the morgue, was an inspirational experience. A gleam of light filtered from the ulcerated head, a superhuman expression illuminated the gangrene flesh and the convulsed features. This crucified corpse was truly that of a god, and without aureole, without nimbus, with only the blood-sprinkled crown of thorns for accoutrement, Jesus appeared in his celestial superessence between the grief-stricken Virgin, blinded with tears, and a St. John whose burning eyes could shed no more tears. These faces, by nature vulgar and commonplace, were resplendent, transfigured by suffering. The common criminal, the beggar woman, and the peasant had vanished. These were now supra-terrestrial beings in the presence of their God. Grunewald was the most uncompromising of idealists. Never before had an artist so magnificently captured such rapture. Never before had an artist leapt with such determination from the topmost peak of the spirit into the very sphere of heaven. He had gone to the two extremes, and he had, in the triumphant depths of squalor, extracted the very essence of charity and despair. In this canvas, a masterpiece of the impossible was revealed, an art ordained to render the invisible and the tangible, to make manifest the lamentable impurity of the flesh, and to make sublime the infinite distress of the soul.